solutions, such as average cost pricing, as well as why those types of second best solutions can arise not just because of explicit government regulation, but through a natural market interaction. We'll then talk about some problems arising from average cost pricing, and then focus on the insurance market, talking about the distortions created by selection, and then applying that empirically to think about the insurance market, as well as some other policy issues that arise in this market. Okay, so today we're going to focus on natural monopoly, but Maria, could you tell us some reasons other than natural monopoly, why monopolies arise in practice?
Because capital technology costs them to succeed more than others, and then they start expanding.
Yeah, so they could just like beat other companies to the market and sort of be there ahead of time before somebody else is able to get in. So that's one important reason. Another is intellectual property, which is what we're going to either, they just have trade secrets, or the government offers them explicit protection. And when that's the focus, when that's the cause of monopoly, we'll talk during the next lecture about whether that's a good or a bad thing. Another way can just be lobbying the government to give you protection from competition. For people who are just coming in, by the way, there's evaluations. You'll have time probably at the end of the class to do them, so it's not a big problem. So that can be very harmful, both because it causes all the harms we associate with monopoly, but also because it encourages people to lobby the government to protect them. And you'll have a problem set, the last problem set will probably have a problem related to that. Another reason can be that if something is in an illegal industry, then once you're already breaking the law to supply the illegal commodity, you might as well break the law also to kill off your competitors in supplying that illegal quantity. And that's why during Prohibition in the United States, during drug control, there have been so much violence associated with these markets. And that should be dealt with obviously through law enforcement rather than other types of policies. And then there's just the issue that Maria pointed out, which is, you can get a temporary advantage. And usually that can be resolved by making markets more transparent, by lowering the bureaucratic barriers to entry into an industry that can help resolve those types of problems. But things can be much trickier when a monopoly is natural or inevitable. Contagious is contagious?
Yeah.
Okay, contagious. What does it mean for monopoly to be natural or inevitable?
Well, like through what we were reading today, that article.
Yeah.
So when it's like economies of scale and like the firm is it's better to have one firm than to have many firms because it's more cost-effective.
Exactly. So one way that would certainly do it is if there's just like plain old economies of scale, right? Then clearly it's going to be more efficient to have just one firm. And this is probably the most common case, but it's not necessary. So there could be a case where there's just, I think I'm actually going to draw some graphs of this in a moment. Let me just see. Okay, so it's not really necessary to have full economies of scale all the way through, right? What you could just have is that there's economies of scale over a big range, and then there starts being diseconomies, but either the market is too small to reach the point of diseconomies, or it starts to reach that part, but if you were to split the one company into two companies, you would be back in the economies of scale part, right? So even without, economies of scale all the way through, there can still be natural monopoly. And in fact, there's many cases where when a market is small, the efficient thing is just to have one company, but as the market gets bigger, it's efficient to have many. And so that's one reason why globalization and trade can help reduce the amount of monopoly, is it expands the size of the market and therefore allows for more competition. Edgar?
When you say that something is sub-additive, does that just mean that that it's most efficient to have just one firm working the market?
Yeah, that means if you have producing anything using two people is less efficient than producing that using just one person. Rocook, could you give us some examples of real world situations that are natural monopolies?
Like companies that have a large fixed costs such as heat, utilities, electricity.
Yeah, those are very good examples. Those are probably the most classical examples of natural monopolies. Electrical utilities, social networks are another example, or telephone networks. So like, you know, imagine you couldn't reach anyone on any cell phone company other than your own, well then it would be it would basically be a natural monopoly, right? Because you would want to reach as many people as possible. Social networks are kind of similar. Facebook is sort of like totally dominant because everyone wants to be able to reach everybody else, right? Another example of this that I don't know if anyone read in the solution to problem set 1, but you know, imagine you have a company that is the job of monitoring people's income to figure out how much income they have. That company might, and one reason they might want to do that is for price discrimination, right? If we know people's income, we're better able to price discriminate. That might be much more efficient if it was done by a centralized agency, because if I'm monitoring Maria's income and Kenneth is her employer, then if I monitor Kenneth's income, it's going to be much easier to also monitor Maria's income because I can make sure those two things are consistent with one another, right? So there's big economies of scale in terms of monitoring income, and therefore it makes a lot of sense for the government to be in charge of all the collection of taxes rather than for individual people to be in charge of different parts of tax collection. Public transportation in many settings is also a natural monopoly. So just to give you a sense of this, the key thing is if we have two firms, average costs are always going to be bigger than if there's just one firm until we get to not just to the minimum point of the average cost, but beyond that, right? Because when we move to two firms, we take the one firm thing and we sort of have to stretch it out a bunch. And that can mean that even as the average cost starts increasing, there can still be some range over which it's still more efficient just to have one than to have two firms in the market. Okay. So the simplest solution to these problems is just to mandate that prices be equal to to marginal costs. But the problem is, not always. So in this case, marginal costs are above average costs at this point, right? But often, when there's economies of scale, price is usually below the average cost, right? Marginal cost is usually below the average cost, right? And so this means that we're going to have subsidies in order to get a firm to charge a price that's equal to marginal cost, because they're going to go bankrupt if they try to charge a price that's below their average cost, right? So to achieve marginal cost pricing, we'd have to have subsidies. And this doesn't just require having someone regulating the firm. It actually requires an active investment continuously of money from the government, right? And this money, yeah. Go ahead.
Why would marginal cost usually be below average?
So whenever average cost is falling, whenever there's economies of scale, marginal cost must be below average cost, right?
Yeah.
Because marginal cost is below average cost whenever average cost is falling, right? And so whenever there's economies of scale locally, the marginal cost will be below the average cost, right? And in order to achieve this, we'll have to put a tax on consumers. We can do, an income tax, a sales tax, and so forth, as from the past lecture. And in fact, when we talked in the last lecture about giving, back money as a lump sum transfer, a lot of this money is not actually given back directly to consumers, but instead is used to fund, as a subsidy, the services that are provided to those consumers so they can be provided at a more efficient price. So some examples are public transportation. The cost of riding on Metra or on the L is a lot less than enough to cover the total cost of operating the system. They're only charging you based on your marginal cost, and then the city of Chicago makes up the difference out of general revenues. The Postal Service usually makes a loss. Most government services, like the DMV and so forth, operate at a loss, and so forth, right? Yeah, take it.
Just, I guess theoretically, so is it not possible for those firms to ever have profit?
For which, you mean the government ones?
Yeah, well, anytime like your average cost is greater than
No, because the firm could produce at the point where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. And that could lead, you see what I mean? So that's what a monopolist will typically do. Even though they have a declining, so even if a monopolist had like a marginal cost curve that was like that, and their average cost curve was like that, if their demand was up here and their marginal revenue was down here, they'd produce at this point, that would give them this price and they'd earn this profit. You see what I mean?
Wait.
Yeah.
So when you say that marginal cost equals price, what price are you referring to? Because the firm is obviously determining that price. So when they always want to charge where marginal cost equals marginal revenue?
Absolutely, but it would be socially optimal for them to charge where marginal cost is equal to price.
But where is the price? So where is that price coming from? Because in a monopoly setting,
Well, the government could just force them to charge that.
well, I'm saying, but so the efficient amount is where MC equals P.
Yeah.
But where do we get P from?
Well, you can just set P equal to M. I mean,
But P is determined by, because in a competitive market, price is determined by all the other firms.
yeah.
But here you have one firm, so what's
How do we figure out what marginal cost is what you're saying? If we're the
I'm
government
trying to
trying to
figure, how do you
regulate
figure out where marginal cost equals price?
yeah, I mean, so that's exactly what we're going to
Okay.
talk about.
Okay, sure.
But
Okay.
yeah, that's a
Okay.
giant problem.
Okay.
I agree with you.
Okay, fine.
So there's two other ways that have been proposed to achieve the optimum other than just imposing marginal cost pricing. One is trying to achieve perfect price discrimination, and who wants to describe why that would achieve the optimum? Yeah.
It removes the deadweight loss, right?
Yeah, that's right, because why does it remove the deadweight loss?
Because those exchanges that wouldn't have, if there's only one price, then the exchanges below the price but above the marginal cost would not happen.
Yep.
And the consumer surplus, as well as the producer surplus there, is not founded.
Yep, that's right. So, if a firm can perfectly price discriminate, then they can capture all that benefit and they achieve the optimum, just like we said a week ago, right? And in practice, that's really difficult, but you can get close using things like nonlinear pricing, two-part tariffs, high-quality third-degree price discrimination, and in fact, that problem is really not that different from just having a local income tax, right? Because you're trying to figure out how much are people willing to pay. That's probably pretty related to their income. And often a lot of these, a lot of these utilities end up basically charging you proportional to your income. So they basically are just charging you an income tax. Another way you can do it, this, which you'll see in the movie Margin Call if you come sit with us, is there's this great scene where they ask one of the guys how he spends his $1.5 million a year salary. And he says, well, I spend about $80,000 on hookers, booze, and restaurants, but actually I can expense most of that to the company. So that really doesn't count. And so that's a great example. That's not part of the marginal cost, it's just part of the average cost of him going out, right? And so he's totally willing to spend all that because he just gets reimbursed by the company, right? Pigouvian subsidies maybe are a little bit better, but they require knowing the demand curve. As Shiraj pointed out, we need to know P prime times Q to figure out what the optimal size of the subsidy is. Perfect price discrimination requires not just knowing the demand curve, but every individual person's willingness to pay, right? So that can require a ton of information as well.